Well, I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and today I'm speaking with Daniel Ortner. And you're an attorney with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. I'm
Right.
excited to be able to speak with you today and learn a little bit more about FIRE. And perhaps would you start with just saying a little bit about your background and how you got involved in the work that you do?
Sure. And thanks, Leslie. Really a pleasure to be here and talk to you. As you said, I'm an attorney at FIRE, and FIRE is a nonpartisan public interest lit, law firm and just advocacy organization for the First Amendment and for free speech. I've been with FIRE almost 2 years. I've been in public interest litigation kind of related to free speech my whole career, legal career. I was previously at the Pacific Legal Foundation doing pretty similar work regarding free speech and equality under the law there as well. I've been, passionate about free speech issues really since I was an undergrad. I actually interned for FIRE as an undergrad because they got involved with some controversies on my undergrad. I went to Brandeis University as an undergrad, and they got involved with defending a professor who was forced to do racial sensitivity training because he taught about the origin of the term wetback in a Latin American studies class. Explained where the term came from and the origin of it, and he got forced to do sensitivity training and to a monitor placed in his classroom and all kinds of things. And so since then, I've been really concerned about censorship in the classroom and censorship more broadly in society. And FIRE has been, really an organization that's championed free speech for everyone, left, right, center, regardless of your views. The kind of one of our mottos is, if it's protected speech, if the Constitution protects it, we're going to defend it, with no apologies for, no throat clearing, no apologies about different kinds of speech. So it's just it's an organization I've loved for a long time, and it's been really an honor to be able to be here litigating on behalf of clients and on behalf of the First Amendment.
So it sounds like when you saw that happen when you were an undergrad, you felt like you disagreed with the forced DEI training, the forced training that professor had to undergo.
Yeah, this is an example where a professor, he was a veteran professor. He'd been there for, I think, 30 plus years, a long, long time, very veteran professor. And he's explaining to his students exactly what you should be doing in a class, which is, there's this term in society, wetback, that people use. They use it as an insult. It's not a favorable term, but where did it come from? What's the origin of it? And he's explaining to them and discussing its origin. And he gets students that are upset about that, and they complain, and the administration, rather than taking his side and saying, free speech or this is protected and it's part of why we have academic classrooms, they say they actually force him to be trained in how to be more sensitive and to be criticized for that. So it's really just an early example, and I think we've seen a lot of these, unfortunately, in the last couple of years. It's gotten increasingly common to target professors in this way for things like a law professor who reads a case that has the N-word in it, just reads it verbatim from a court and gets disciplined for that.
Wow.
Or someone who assigns classic literature that has, similarly has racial epithets in it and gets disciplined for that. So there's really it's really a growing problem, and I think this was a early example of that, and it just really disturbed me at the time, and still does today.
At that time, did you have a sense that there was a majority of students who were sensitive to these issues in the way that these reactive students were, or did you feel like you were a part of a majority of people who were really welcoming more nuance in speech?
Yeah, I really felt like the majority was in favor of speech and kind of outraged by this. I was the opinion section editor at Brandeis at the time, actually, and so I helped gather people op-eds and draft work on editorials for the campus paper at the time. And I think the sense I got was a lot of people were really outraged by this, and the way it was handled was really poorly handled. There was not like clear due process. It was just actually the faculty senate at Brandeis, I think, did a very good job of advocating for their colleague. I think so. What I saw then was definitely, I think, a majority, at least definitely among the faculty, and also I think among the students, supporting free speech. And unfortunately, I think that seems to have shifted in many campuses, where now you have, I think, students and faculty really advocating against free speech and against their colleagues in a way that I find really alarming.
Mhm.
Greg Lukianov, who's the president of Fire, and Jonathan Haidt, they wrote their I think one that book about this, the coddling of the American mind, um, was really about this shift in culture in campus that happened around 2014, 2015. They kind of identified it as that really being a shift where before that point, they'd been doing free speech, and Greg Lukianov, with Fire, founded in 1999, so had been doing free speech work for more than 15 years at that point. Before that point, he really saw students standing up for free speech, uh, advocating for greater ability to students to speak and professors to speak. And then they really saw a shift around that time where the students kind of became the main advocates for censorship after that point.
I'm glad to hear you kind of pinpointing that time period, because that's been my sense was that there was a shift that took place. And I would, the last higher education experience I had been around 2010, and then I went back to school in 2019 into a graduate program, and it felt really different. And
Yeah.
yet I've heard a lot of people say, as they're analyzing what's going on in the culture right now, no, this has been creeping all along. This has been in there all along. There wasn't really a major shift. It's like the frog boiling, you just finally noticed it. And so when you're highlighting that shift, what can you speak a little bit more about that? Was there a sudden change in how campuses were operating?
I think what Greg Lukianov and Jonathan Haidt found was they saw a real shift. I think I mean, both those things can be true. There's kind of a gradual build up, but there's a point where they reach like a critical mass
Mhm.
where there's a real shift. I think both those things can be maybe true at the same time, but it was really a point where then this is like the period or the height of cancellations, for instance, for commencement speakers. Those couple of years around 2014, 15, 16, that was like really a height of that, where students were really demanding that they not be exposed to commencement speakers that were controversial.
Mhm.
Um, and universities kind of canceling, agreeing with them and canceling all host a wide variety of controversial speakers, from politicians to thinkers, the wide gamut of people being canceled. But that was like really, I think, an expression of that. This, like, we don't want to hear ideas that we find upsetting or troubling. We don't
Mhm.
want to be exposed to them. We're harmed by even hearing them.
Mhm.
And that's what I think Greg Lukiana and Hyatt, in their book, they talk a lot about that. The culture where hearing an idea you disagree with is now equated with harm, psychological and even physical harm. And when you do that, you kind of psychologize it, where even hearing ideas you don't agree with can be harmful to you, and then that's a very short line to that, from that to censorship. So I think that's a big piece of what they talk about in their book, the, the increased view of speech as harmful to
Mhm.
you psychologically and physically, as it really being a key factor in the change of culture on campuses and elsewhere.
Was that experience of witnessing and writing about and engaging with that issue when you were an undergrad, was that influential in your decision to go into law?
Yeah, definitely. I think really saw I've always been kind of mindful of this, but the need to how the legal system and the culture really shape what happens, and the need for strong protections for individual rights. It's always been something that I've felt really strongly about, and I think seeing that and being able to be part of advocating for it really made me want to go to law school.
Mhm. Have you noticed in your work with fire, is most of the work that you do end up most of the complaints that you end up seeing, or does it center on race, or are there other issues that are coming up that is gender as prevalent as race? What are you seeing free
I should
speech
say
issues
Fire
around?
does a lot of work both on and off campus, across the country, and so some of the issues we're involved with have nothing to do with kind of the campus issues. But Fire's bread and butter has been for a long time, issues on campus. I think that there's a variety of things. I mean, we've represented students. Obviously right now the Palestinian and Israeli conflict is a huge source of controversy and debate, and that's not about either race or
Mhm.
gender. It's
Mhm.
not, yeah, to some degree, perhaps about ethnicity or race, but largely it's about something else. There's been controversies over abortion, over gun rights, I mean, a variety of topics. But I would say that since 2020, at least in there's was a real rise, especially among for professors being targeted and ultimately many being fired related to topics like race,
Mhm.
DEI related topics. Really an increased sensitivity starting around 2020, and a significant increase in professors being canceled or fired, targeted for their speech or fired. There's Fire has a database that tracks these kind of cancellations, and I mean the date, they really skyrocketed around 2020,
Mhm.
and so there was Fire's database of these, for instance, had only four attempts to punish scholars for their speech in 2000, and
Mhm.
there were 145 of those that our database identified in 2022. So really dramatically increased.
Wow. Yeah.
And the numbers have fluctuated a little bit over the years, but there's gone up a little bit, gone up down a little bit depending on the year since 2020. But there's definitely been a significant turn since 2020, and a dramatic increase.
Just since 2020.
Really, since really 2020, I think specifically for professors being targeted for their speech. And not all of these are about race issues, but I think race was the really significant increase around that subject in particular.
Are there a couple of cases in particular that you're able to speak about that you've worked with?
Yeah, I mean to say, one of our challenges around the topic of race is increased what we've spoken out about the increased requirements of faculty to write diversity statements in order to be hired, and then also the rise of efforts to force professors to teach and views like anti-racism
Mhm.
in the classroom. And so I'm the lead attorney on a case that we have in California, for instance, targeting the California community colleges, which there's millions of almost 2 million students that are part of the community college system. So it's a massive system that affects large number of students. They require a couple years ago, 2 years ago, enacted a regulation requiring all faculty throughout the whole system to teach, advocate, and advance and promote DEI principles,
Mm.
like racism and equity in every single classroom,
Wow.
every single class, regardless of the subject. This applies to the chemistry professor.
Mm.
Two representing two of our six professor plaintiffs are chemistry professors, and they're not sure how do I talk about the anti-racist identity of boron. What do I do? How do I actually introduce this into the classroom to satisfy their expectations? And so that's a challenge we have, to where there's really an effort to force agreement on these really controversial topics.
Mhm. Mhm.
They have a glossary, for instance, that the community college system put out, which equates advocating for color blindness, for instance, with
Mhm.
racism. It
Mhm.
also equates the concept of merit
Mhm.
as being racist. If you talk about merit and the importance of treating people based on their merit, you're perpetuating a racist system. So the really extreme definitions that really take a stance on a very hotly contested debate.
Mhm.
That's really troubling and problematic, I think, from a First Amendment perspective.
Mhm. I've seen these as well. These like style guides or new terminology guidance memos that are sent out by universities. University of Washington did one a little while back that had things like the word SEE was ableist. So you're supposed to avoid using the word C. And it just seems like such a minefield. It's really difficult to avoid trigger points if you're going by this kind of ideological guidance.
Yeah, it's like a redefinition of language, and it makes it so if you're a professor, you don't know what you can say or not say, what you can assign or not assign. We have some of our plaintiffs in that case who used to sign things like Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, and now they're not sure, can I even assign that? Both because it has the N word in it, and
Mhm.
also that's a whole nother controversial touch point. And then also because it, it advances views in favor of color blindness or equality, equal treatment. And so they're not sure, can we teach this and advocate these views in the classroom? And they're just they're unsure, can we have discussions? Can we watch a debate where they debate the death penalty, or they debate drug legalization, and there's debate about the racial impact of these things?
Mhm.
Can we actually have conversations in the classroom with our students about these topics, or do we have to choose one side of on these topics? And it's really stifling their ability to teach, uh, really do their job, which is
Mhm.
to teach students to think critically about these issues, to expose them to different sides, to encourage them to be critical thinkers about these really important topics in our society.
You mentioned the letter from Birmingham jail, and you mentioned the N word, and I and you've mentioned that a couple of times. That's come up a couple of times already. It seems like it's really fascinating that a word can have so much power. I'm not a fan of using swear words in general, so I'm not going to list off all the swear words that would be vulgar and unprofessional to use, but there's that word in particular among swear words has so much power. And so it's interesting that even in a document that would demonstrate the harm of epithets and condescending speech, you still couldn't use it in that context.
Yeah, one of my favorite, or I guess see favorite maybe isn't the right way to put it. Most, I think, ridiculous examples of this kind of culture of censorship of speech in the last couple of years was a professor at USC, in University of Southern California, where he's a Chinese language instructor, and he was talking about filler words in Chinese that are kind of like ers and ums or likes, those similar
Mhm,
filler
mhm,
words. One of those in Chinese is a word that's nega,
mhm.
Neg, nega, and when you say it can sound like the N word. Uh,
Right.
and he talked about that in a classroom, and he got temporarily removed from the classroom for that.
Is
Uh,
that right? Even though it's a foreign language.
Foreign language, a word that is not a swear word in Chinese, not negative in any way,
Wow.
as part of a discussion about filler words. So it wasn't
Yeah.
like out of context, or meant to be insulting. It was a discussion about filler words. And yeah, students complained about that, and he was temporarily removed from the classroom. I think they reinstated him quickly. I don't think it went any further than that. Uh,
Mm.
but it's just, I think, a really crazy example of that.
Yeah.
Over sensitivity, over language, and anything that even sounds sounds like it could be offensive.
Well, and it's also stunning that he was removed from class for that, because I think one of the things that it really seems to be a factor here is the outsized power of student complaints over educators. I mean, if you had a student complain about that, it should take a 5-minute conversation with the professor to straighten that out and understand, whoever the complaint went to. If it went to administration calls professor, and then it's very quickly hammered out. Oh, it wasn't a racial epithet. I was actually explaining this filler word in Chinese.
Right,
This
right.
should have been sorted very quickly. But what do you make of this catering to fragility and to sensitivity?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things going on. One is that universities are very afraid of any kind of lawsuit, like some of the Title IX changes, for instance, that just recently were announced, make it, I think, universities very wary of anything that could possibly be considered harassment based on sex or race, and so there's a real sensitivity around that issue of fear of litigation. I think that also the other thing that you have is you have a lot of bureaucrats and diversity bureaucrats that are specifically hired to be sensitive on these topics. That's what they're looking out for.
Mm,
Gonna call everything a spade. If their job is to identify uh, racial discrimination or problems on campus, and so they're going to find issue with everything. In the going back to our lawsuit in California, the community colleges, they're this model framework that they put out. They have, for instance, language there warning professors not to, what they call, quote, call weaponizing academic freedom to, quote, inflict curricular trauma on our students, and that's in the
what
material.
does that mean?
I mean, means basically if it's offensive, it's traumatizing. And so
Curricular
that's kind of,
trauma.
yeah, inflict curricular trauma on our students.
Wow.
And that language is just saying, whatever's controversial, whatever is upsetting is traumatizing. And you can't do that to the poor students who can't handle different ideas, can't handle controversial topics. We infantilize them. We treat them like
Yeah.
little children.
Yeah.
And that's I think the mentality that's grown among the diversity, bureaucrats that are hired to focus on this topic and to find problems everywhere with it. And so I think that's part of what's happening is you have all very the culture where speech is harmful and we need to protect our students and cater to them rather than encourage their growth, encourage debate and challenging ideas to be considered.
Oh, that's just really interesting because when you're talking about sensitivity bureaucrats, um, policing professors to make sure they don't inflict curricular trauma
Yeah.
on students, it's like, how are they supposed to be? Is it okay to ask students to expand their perspectives at all? Or is an expansion of one's perspective a form of harm? Are you supposed to just allow people to stay
Yeah.
in exactly the same emotional state and intellectual state that they are when they arrive at school? And if so, what's the point of education?
Yeah, exactly. And this isn't, we talked about DEI, kind of California's work, but there on the other side, anti-DEI efforts, I think have had similar kind of similar effort to like
Okay.
silence debate. Fire has a lawsuit in Florida against the Stop Woke Act, which is Florida's effort to ban certain concepts from the classroom. To tell professors you can't advance ideas like anti-racism. You can't suggest that be that merit is racist. You can't even talk about these concepts in the classroom. So we actually have a lawsuit. We got the law in Florida enjoined in the district court, and that was just an argument argued a few weeks ago at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals on the opposite side of the coin. So it really is not a partisan issue. It's on either side. You want to allow debate and
Mhm.
discussion in the classroom. These are really important topics. I mean, how do we deal with racism and kind of legacy of race in America? What do we do about these topics? It's something that scholars debate about, that general public debates about, and we should allow that debate to continue. It shouldn't be the state shouldn't be taking one side or the other and saying you need to be silent. You can't talk about these things. You can't debate them.
Hmm. What are so if you're looking at this from both sides, so it doesn't matter about sides so much, it's about the process of stifling speech and not about the content of what the speech is. So with that said, are there limits to free speech? What is Fire's stance on that? What should all speech be okay all the time, or how should we think about this?
Yeah, I think the Constitution sets a very high bar, and it says, uh, you know, Congress or government, actors generally shall make no law respecting freedom of speech. There are, of course, limits on that. The court has said, there's certain categories of speech, for instance, like speech that directly incites to imminent lawless violence, true threats that you're directly threatening someone in a direct and intentional way. Um, Other speech of that nature. I mean, that's harassing and again, not just I don't like it, but really harassing speech. There are other categories that the courts have found to be unprotected or having some limited protection. And so I think those exceptions need to be narrowly defined and very specific. And the government has the burden to explain why they're censoring speech. And I think courts, the Supreme Court and other courts have been very good about this in recent decades of saying the government has the obligation to prove why a restriction on speech is necessary. They have the burden. They have to explain specifically why the restriction is necessary, why they couldn't be less restrictive of speech while still achieving their goals. They have to look for alternatives to better, to achieve the same goal without censoring speech. And so that those limits are there to ensure that speech is protected robustly to ensure that speech is not chilled or stifled or limited in our society.
Mhm. Well, and what in the classroom setting, higher education setting, what constitutes stifling speech? For instance, does I know you and I have talked before about my situation with my graduate school. And so I tried to speak in class. I tried to raise questions about the CRT material that we were learning. And I was subject to ad hominem attacks and the professor crying and getting sort of this, I would say it was psychological bullying. I don't know if it would legally constitute stifling of speech at that point. How bad does it have to be before your speech has been stifled?
Yeah, in the academic classroom, I mean, there's a lot going on there.
Mhm,
We have professors who have First Amendment rights in the classroom to teach.
mhm,
You have the university does have a right to set curriculum as well, to set standards. It can't, in doing so, it can't discriminate based on viewpoint. It can't tell the professor you can't share your views. It can't tell
mhm,
students you can't share your views or disagree, or you have to adopt a certain perspective to pass, to pass and to advance. Like that is those are limits. And then students obviously have the right to speak out without being punished, without being limited. And so there's a balancing act going on there in the classroom in particular between those rights. I think the key is what happened to you where you're basically told, if you don't agree with our view on these topics, you can't advance, you can't graduate, you can, however successful you are in the course material, however well you do on your exams, this is like an ideological litmus test on whether you can pass. That's a clear violation.
mhm, mhm,
Where it becomes if you don't agree with our view on a topic, you can't graduate.
mhm,
That's a clear line. And then I think in the classroom, I mean, there has to be room, I think, for debate and discussion. Professors obviously I think can encourage students to play devil's advocate. Can play devil's advocate, can
mhm,
encourage students to take different sides of the debate. You're going to advocate this position and you're going to advocate that view, even if that's not what they personally agree. I think that's part of the classroom and the discussion. But fundamentally, you can't make you affirm and agree with views that you disagree with.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, it seems like it's challenging because there's so much that is below the point where law would get involved that happens in these kinds of situations, and finding
Yeah,
that line is difficult.
I think the litigators like going to court is usually the most more extreme cases where someone gets suspended, where someone gets fired or disciplined.
Mhm, mhm,
Well, another piece of what we do, Fire does is writing, advocate letters, to universities, for instance, saying we heard about this situation that happened, here, here are the First Amendment principles. We
mhm,
urge you to live up to them and to take certain actions. And part of it's also a cultural battle, to create a culture of where speech is respected, where your reaction when you hear ideas that are controversial is not to run and to try to censor someone and remove them. You can
mhm,
disagree strongly. You can speak out, very firmly, and no, we're not saying people can't have very strong views about different ideas. People can and should have strong opinions, I think, in society, but the kind of automatic assumption of, well, I disagree with you, therefore I'm going to silence you, um,
mhm,
really problematic and
mhm,
needs to change. And so that's part of what we're trying to do as an organization is push back on that and create a culture where free speech is appreciated and respected for all that it does, I think, because there's so many benefits that come from having this robust culture of debate and discussion. I think from just exposing errors to really changing your own views, advance
mhm,
learning and challenging your the weaknesses of your position. And just also just value of having a society where people respect each other and listen to each other,
mhm,
even if they disagree. There's so many important values that come from culture where free speech is honored and protected.
mhm. In terms of law, how do you see identity politics and political correctness showing up in the legal field? I saw a clip not that long ago from some hearing in Colorado. I was speaking with a woman named Ellen Danick, who has been active in pushing back on some decisions to allow trans-identified males into female prisons.
Mm.
And during this clip, there's a committee chair who is kicking people out for misgendering, things like this. And so that's really interesting. And when you see this happening in a a governmental official space, it's pretty chilling. And I think that it leads a lot of people to be scared that our whole legal system is going woke as well. What are your thoughts on that? And what have you seen?
Yeah, well, you identify. I mean, we have seen there's definitely a problem with city councils,
Mhm.
town, school boards, uh, congressional, meetings being, people being kicked out for their speech. There, and I think we've also seen this in schools as well, a real sensitivity. That we have a case that we filed in Michigan over a student who was disciplined for having "Let's Go Brandon" clothing,
Mm,
for instance, with that saying on it.
mhm,
Um, that where just real oversensitivity
mhm,
to to speech of all any kind, that or symbols or anything that people are uncomfortable with. So I think you are seeing that, I think, in government meeting settings, in schools in particular, where these kind of use of vaguer standards like offensive or inappropriate is used to censor things that are make people uncomfortable, and that's ultimately not what even the law, even in K through 12, where there's less protection than in colleges. There's the famous case, the Tinker case in the Supreme Court, where it was during the Vietnam War, people wanting to wear black armbands to protest the war. And the Supreme Court really strongly emphasized, your rights don't stop at the schoolhouse gate. And just because your ideas are offensive to others, doesn't mean the school can censor you and stop you from speaking out. So even in the K through 12 setting, that's such an important principle. And so that's something we're really fighting for, to avoid. Really, it's kind of the idea of a heckler's veto, right? The people that are offended can silence you because they're offended. That's a really dangerous idea.
mhm,
So that's something that really pushing back on, in K through 12 and elsewhere, where you can't, the government can't censor you because of other people being offended by what you're saying. Their
mhm,
re, the reaction to your speech, the fact that people are upset by it, should not be a basis to be able to shut you down and stop you from
mhm,
speaking. And
mhm.
so the government has an obligation to protect your speech, against people that are offended by it, to not stop you from speaking.
So are you optimistic that the law will remain a robust protection at the end of the day, or do you worry that newer law school graduates are being trained in this way and that it's going to impact how cases are decided?
I'm optimistic about the legal direction. I think the Supreme Court, right now is better than it's ever been on
Mm,
many top issues of free speech. Really, I mean, the Roberts Court has been excellent on many free speech issues. I think that, and really, it's not as much of a partisan issue. You have judges that are appointed by either party that are very good on free speech. See if I think very robust precedent, and it's being strengthened, I think, in a lot of opinions. So overall, I'm optimistic about the legal direction. I think I'm less optimistic about the cultural direction that we're
mm,
moving towards on free speech, and obviously that has an impact, whether it's now or in next generation. Like those that
mhm,
are going to be in positions of power are going to be those that are going to be increasingly hostile to free speech, increasingly hostile to different ideas. Down the line, that's going to have an effect. So kind of short term, I'm very optimistic, but I think that there's a real danger to the culture that doesn't regard free speech highly, doesn't really want to hear different ideas. There's a real danger to that.
mhm. It does seem like it's going to take a long time to work this out of the cultural system, even if things are put back on track. A lot of people have been impacted and are going to go forward with these ideas for a long time to come.
Yeah, I think there's some signs of for some encouraging signs. I think we talked a lot about the diversity statements and
Mhm,
DI issues in campus, and for instance, recently you had MIT, which is very influential, obviously, very prestigious university, say that they're no longer going to use DEI statements in hiring or decisions regarding faculty, requiring these kind of statements of fealty to DEI
mhm,
principles.
mhm,
That's a really positive development. You've had I guess some states also passing laws like North Carolina and other Kansas, I believe, and others that are limiting the use of these DI statements to require ideological conformity. So I think there are some positive developments as well, and I hope that people are are kind of getting tired of this culture of censorship and canceling. It's exhausting, I think, for people to try to keep up with it and to
Mhm.
avoid being canceled for themselves. And I think I hope that people are waking up to that and just realizing that it's not a healthy or positive climate to live in ultimately.
Mhm. Going back to legal education, that's something I'm curious about how DEI is being used in law school right now. I was really surprised when I went to graduate school and I was in an applied psychology program, and we're learning fundamental principles of human psychology and development and social behavior, and then right next to it, like a graft, this DEI stuff that
Yeah.
didn't fit with what we had just been taught. So it was like this strange meld. It's kind of like when you talked about the chemistry professor being told to teach DEI. It's like this violates some of the principles that we had just been taught, and yet we're being taught to think in this way as well. So there's a lot of dissonance there. And I went to law school back in 2009. I left as a 2L, but I can't really imagine DEI in law school. And I'm wondering, is it infiltrating? Is it being taught to legal students right now?
Yeah, interesting. My wife's doing her master's in social work right now, so and she's having a very similar experience to what you had, where it's like every class and there's such an overload of DI topics in that program. I don't think law school is a little slower to change, and I think fortunately more of a tradition of certain topics get taught. You have a bar exam that people are kind of preparing for, or you have classic topics. I think it's better positioned to resist it than other fields, but I think you still do have some of that. The ABA has been, unfortunately, the American Bar Society has been advocating for DEI initiatives in education to be required for schools to have their credit, be recognized by them, and so that there's been I think a stronger pushback in the legal education field than in other fields that I've seen. So I'm less pessimistic about legal education overall as far as the fields of study go.
Mhm.
Um, but there's still, I think, some problematic developments, and especially among the ABA's kind of advocacy. One of the things that this is after law school, you have for instance the ABA advocated for the rule 8.4G, which was it's a kind of almost a civility code for lawyers related to harassment about topics related to race or other controversial topics, race, sex, sexual orientation, where if a lawyer, for instance, in a CLE would take a controversial position on topics like race, like say that color blindness is the way to go, and we harass the anti-racism is problematic, that they could have been potentially disciplined for racial harassment um, under this model rule. And so, but fortunately, a lot of states have resisted this rule. It's actually been not widely accepted. Model rules usually get adopted by states into their disciplinary proceedings pretty quickly, and this one's been really rejected by a lot of states, and some very strong rejections. And the few states that have adopted them, we haven't seen these applied very draconianly to silent speech. There's a fear of litigation, I think, and a fear of challenges. So that's, I think, a good example where the profession, the kind of more ideologically minded advocacy has been checked by, I think, attorneys and states that are resistant to it, and attorneys that are willing to fight back against it and challenge these kinds of policies. That's, I think, been a positive story on the whole, even though I'm still worried about states adopting this in the future.
One thing that people often say is well, people often compare race and gender ideology, the DEI ideology, to a state religion.
Yeah.
And I wonder, what is your perspective on that? I mean, we see this coming through the higher education, job training, every, publicly funded sector seems to be including this, including K through 12. We've got a lot of this in K through 12. And how does that comparison work from a legal standpoint? And is there any way to challenge it on that basis?
It's not something I'm not. I've previously worked for the Beckett Fund doing religious liberty work at one point in my early in my career, but I don't do a lot of religious liberty and at work. So, but I would say like generally the comparison. I don't think that legally the comparison holds up as far as
Okay.
it being a state mandated religion
Okay.
in some way. But I think culturally you're onto something that there's a religious fervency to this ideology, the way it's being enforced,
Hmm.
the way that there's taboos and certain words you can't say and certain things you can't do that are these microaggressions. There's a real, I think, religious fervor to that, and a real danger to the degree to which it's become a kind of totalizing ideology where people are so committed to seeing the world through this lens and imposing that on everything. So I do share that concern. I don't know legally if that I don't think that legally that framing works. But I think the biggest problem is just the degree to which these ideologies are hostile to free speech,
Hmm.
are hostile to differences of opinion. Um, I think you can have your strong opinions about the best way to address racial problems in society, but be more open to different views and different perspectives. Um, and so I think that the biggest problem in my mind is that this ideology is very committed to any opinion to the contrary is racist and oppressive and colonizing and just these things that shut down discussion and shut down debate um, are
Hmm.
really disturbing to me.
Mhm. Mhm. And I guess I also wanted to ask you a little bit about Title IX. You mentioned Title IX and how recent changes are being implemented. So would you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, these Title IX regulations. I mean, there's a lot of different issues with the Title IX rules. I mean, they obviously expand the rules to sexual orientation related issues, and that's a very controversial issue. But I think the thing that we've been focused on Fire is the lack of protection, like due process and other protections for students or others that are accused of sexual harassment under Title IX. So first of all, they kind of expanded it so that harassment under other civil rights laws have to be severe and pervasive, which means it can't just be a one-time joke, a
Mhm.
comment about political topics, kind of like unrelated to, like, it has to be like you have to be harassing someone with remarks and her behavior that's directed to them that takes away their enjoyment of educational opportunities or employment opportunities in the employment context. And these are really important protections to make sure that harassment law does not become just a civility code
Mhm.
for society. That people can be uncivil, they can be rude to each other, they can disagree sharply, but that's part of living in a society where people have different opinions. And so I think they blur the lines, these rules on what is harassment in a way that's potentially dangerous, and then they don't really allow or limit protections for things like due process, the right to cross-examine, the right to have an impartial individual adjudicating your proceeding. So there's some really disturbing limitations on due process and on the ability of individuals who are accused to defend themselves.
Hmm. And how do you see this showing up, or how do you anticipate this will show up in culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, hopefully there are a lot of lawsuits already that have been filed against the Title IX regulations.
Hmm.
Many states have filed lawsuits against this. Other organizations are involved with lawsuits as well. So, it will kind of take time to see what actually ever gets enforced or implemented or doesn't. So I hope that this gets stopped in the
Hmm.
courtroom or elsewhere. But I think what you're going to see is increasingly individuals that are accused of harassment around sexual harassment uh, are increasingly going to be railroaded, not given due process, disciplined without actually having a chance to defend themselves, without actually being able to hear the accusations against them clearly, without being able to know what exactly am I being accused of, what did I do, what did I say, and it's going to be, I think, really problematic. One of the things is that the Title IX change increases the obligations of universities to take action, even if the harassment happens off campus, somewhere completely unrelated to the university. And so you're going to, I think, have increasingly have students be under the microscope for anything they do or say, to those of the, to those that they're romantically involved with, to particularly to women, men saying to women in particular. And so it's going to be, I think, really created a real cultural problem for college students, kind of
Mm,
adding to all we've talked about this culture of fear about if I say something wrong, I can get in trouble. If I speak out in line, I can get in trouble. It just creates this, overall, really stifling environment for
mm,
students.
mhm. Well, when you talk about the shift that happened in 2014, 2015, and then the big jump in 2020 in these sorts of anti-free speech issues in the classrooms, but also there's this concert, it feels like a very well organized rollout of DEI and the CRT, gender ideology, all of these suppressive ideologies seem to be rolling out everywhere all at once. So it feels like a very well organized effort to remake a lot of our culture. And if you agree and see it that way, well, what do you think is the best way to push back? Is it these individual lawsuits? Is it just one at a time and then you chip away at it and the whole thing falls apart? Or is there some other strategy we should be thinking about?
I don't know that I don't know if I agree that it's kind of this organized. I mean, I think there are people that are really pushing these ideologies and these ideas, but I think overall, unfortunately, it's more organic than that in the sense that you have a generation of like I think like Greg Lukianov and John Haidt in their book talk about a generation that are kind of coddled, that are raised without where they see being exposed to different ideas and challenging ideas as harmful or traumatizing. I think it's going to take a lot of effort, a combination of things. The
Mm,
legal challenges are really important, I think, because they challenge the most often the most extreme versions, the most extreme applications, kind of push back against the most extreme efforts to silence or to force different views. I think what we're doing, and we talked about the California and the Florida lawsuits, but challenges both sides when they're pushing their ideology and forcing their views. That's really important. But I think
mm,
it's going to take more than that, and it's going to take cultural effort to. I think for people that are, I think what you're doing on your platform and other influencers, other podcasters and others that are really speaking out about free speech, uh, speaking against censorship and cancel culture, I think is really really important. And then just individually, being making a conscious effort as an individual to be open to different ideas, to speak to those who you disagree with, to work on ensuring that we're exposed to different sides of the debate on topics. As an individual, being working to not be in an echo chamber.
mm,
Social media, I think, is amazing, and there's many good things about social media. But one of the problems has been the creating an echo chamber where you only see news from your side of the aisle. You only talk to people that agree with you. So I think for us as individuals, my view is that we need to be really conscious of avoiding that, speaking to those we disagree with, seeking out conversations, seeking out opportunities to have friendships with people on different sides of the political spectrum. Um, that's, I think, a really important effort that is individual. Lawsuits and lawyers can't cause that to happen. So I think it really we need a combination of all those things.
depolarization on the individual level.
Yeah.
Mhm. Is there anything that I have not asked you about that you think is important to highlight right now?
Let's see. I think well, we've talked about a lot of different things. I think what fire does, and I think we need is principled defense of free speech. And I think that unfortunately a lot of the times uh, free speech becomes a political football where one side defends it when it's convenient for them and when they agree with the speech, and doesn't defend it when they disagree with it. And so we really need um, encourage consistent advocacy for free speech for everyone.
Mhm.
Because free speech, if it's only to protects what you think and doesn't protect others, that's not one. It's not really free, and two, when power shifts and your views become in the minority, it's not going to protect you. We need to worry about protecting the views of even those that we disagree with most strongly, because otherwise it's not going to be this bulwark against censorship or against silencing.
Mhm.
So just really want to, I think, emphasize the importance of standing up for speech for everyone, even those that we disagree with, maybe even especially. That's when it's most important to protect speech, is when we disagree with the views. I disagree with you, but I defend your right to speak.
Mhm.
That's such an important concept, and it's, I think, what the Constitution requires, but it's more than that. I think it's the way that we have a free society, and a society where everyone is free to express themselves
Mhm.
ultimately.
I think that's such an important thing to highlight, and it's interesting that right now so many people say that free speech is a right-wing issue. It's a coded right wing, which is just amazingly short-sighted, if you ask me.
Yeah, I mean, free speech and the main advocate, beneficiaries, I think, of free speech were the civil rights movement. I think, really so much of the work of the free speech movement was against censorship of the civil rights movement. Southern states trying to shut down or arrest civil rights advocates. And free speech, that was a big point in the free speech movement. I think anti-war efforts, and the LGBT movement, frankly, has benefited immensely from free
Mhm.
speech, and not be in lack of censorship. And so I think that left and right, kind of political movements have benefited from free speech. And it's not a partisan issue. It doesn't have to be. It's we can defend speech even when we disagree with it, because we understand how important it is to our society, to the democratic society, to uh, fulfillment, individual fulfillment and freedom.
How would someone get in contact with Fire if they wanted to speak with someone about their own issue? And what kind of issues are you specifically looking for people to reach out on?
Yeah, so on our website, the fire.org, on there, we have, you can submit a complaint, a case that you have. We've gotten, we get in touch, we look into it and get in touch with you. We do a wide variety of issues. I think campus and off campus, free speech. Obviously, as a public interest organization, we have to be very selective in the cases we get involved with. So we can't guarantee to anyone that we can get involved. But if your views are being censored, especially by the government, public universities, public employment, city ordinances, really anything like that, we'd love to hear from you. And again, our website is thefire.org. You can also reach out to me or to others from Fire, and we're happy to help out.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you, and I'm glad to get more background information on these issues and where things are headed.
Yeah, absolutely. Really a pleasure. And thanks for the work you're doing in fighting for free speech. And yeah, really grateful for the chance to talk to you, Leslie.
Thanks.